In this episode, learn how to introduce more ambient light to your flash exposures.
AdoramaTV presents Exploring Photography with Mark Wallace.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on AdoramaTV. I'm Mark Wallace. Well, this week we're going to be talking about two exposure triangles. The exposure triangle for ambient light, it's the normal old exposure triangle that we all know and love, and the flash exposure triangle. There's actually two different exposures happening at the same time. That's right. When you add a flash to your camera, one exposure becomes two. You're getting the ambient light. That's all the light that we can't control, things like the sun and these lights that you turn on inside your house, and you're getting an exposure from the flash. Now, we all know about the normal old exposure triangle. It has the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter. But the flash exposure triangle is a little bit different. Now, it also has the ISO because the camera's ISO determines how sensitive it is to light. It doesn't matter if it's light from the flash or ambient light. And we know that the flash has to have its light go through the aperture. So those two things are in common between the exposure triangle and the flash exposure triangle. But when we get to the shutter, well, that's where things turn around just a little bit. And the reason for that is that the shutter in your camera really has no impact on the flash at all. It's like it doesn't exist. Well, why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. When you're using a speed light in a normal mode, not high speed sync, when we get there, that's different. We're not going to talk about that, but that's an exception. But when you're using your flash in a normal mode or you're using a studio flash, things work like this. When you press the shutter release on your camera, your shutter opens, and when it's fully open, that's when the flash fires. Now, what that means is because the shutter is completely open, it's just like it doesn't exist at all, which means it can't have an impact on the flash. So what's the third thing that impacts the flash? Well, it's the flash power, the output power, if it's at full power or half power or quarter power, etc. So our flash exposure triangle is ISO, aperture, and flash output. And so that means that you can control your flash output and the ambient light output, or not the output, but the exposure, the flash exposure and the ambient light exposure independent of each other. You can make the ambient light brighter or darker, and you can change the flash exposure brighter or darker. Now, changing the flash exposure, we've probably done this a million times. You just adjust your flash output up or down or use flash exposure compensation, and it works terrific. But to change the ambient light, we need to change our shutter speed, and we can really affect how our ambient light is in our photo. Now, to explain all this, it's really sort of difficult to do that in the studio, so we're going to go outside and I'll show you exactly how it works. All right, well, now we're outside. I put a jacket on in this sort of cold weather out here in Gavin's backyard, and I've asked Brian to join me. You might remember Brian from some of my previous episodes, and so now we're going to walk through how the shutter will allow us to increase the amount of ambient light that our camera sees. So remember, the exposure triangle is ISO, shutter, and aperture. So I have my shutter at 180th of a second. My aperture is right now at about 4, aperture f4, and ISO is at 200. So with those settings, I'll turn off my flash. Brian, look straight at me. I'll take a picture, and you can see that the ambient light just doesn't really exist. It's totally underexposed. Now remember, the flash exposure triangle is ISO, it's the aperture, but it's the flash output. Now, when I turn on my flash, this flash is going to use its through the lens metering to give us a proper exposure. So the light that we're seeing here, Brian, look right at me, is just the light from the flash. And it's pretty obvious because Brian has that really flat flash on the camera look. So how do we introduce more ambient light? We don't want to change the ISO, we don't want to change the aperture because that is set for our flash, it's all good. But if we start slowing down our shutter, watch what happens. So I'm going to slow this down a couple stops. We'll take a picture here. You can see now that some of the ambient light is creeping in. I'll slow this down a couple more here. So now we're at 45th of a second, and you see more ambient light. Let's keep going down here. So now we're getting to a much slower speed. That's 1/24th of a second, and you can clearly see there that we have a lot of ambient light, and because we have so much ambient light, the flash doesn't have to work so hard. So we're going to keep just taking that down a little bit. Look at that, that's 1/12 of a second, and now we can see the garden and all of that kind of stuff. Because the camera's on a tripod, and because the background isn't moving, we don't have to really worry about camera shake that much. And because Brian is being frozen by the flash, we can sort of get away with that slow shutter speed. So taking that shutter, slowing it down will introduce more ambient light. Well, there you have it. As you can see, changing the shutter speed affects our ambient light. Now, I've skipped over a few things, or else this video would be 20,000 minutes long, specifically high-speed sync. But don't worry, that is covered in another video that I did. You can find it at the Adorama Learning Center, and you can see it. I've added a link in the description of this video. And one more thing that you might want to know, and that is sync speed. That's the fastest speed you can use when your flash is on your camera. I've also described how all of that works with some groovy animations, so you can check that out. Again, it's in the description of this video. There's a link, or just go to the Adorama Learning Center. And speaking of the Adorama Learning Center, you should check it out. There are hundreds of videos there. They're absolutely free, and if you don't want to miss a single episode, well, just click the subscribe button. Why not? It's absolutely free, and that way you don't miss anything. Well, thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you again next time.
Do you want great looking prints at low cost? Be sure to visit our easy-to-use online printing service. Adorama Pix has professionals who treat your images with the utmost care that you can count on. For a quick turnaround on photos, cards, or albums, use AdoramaPix.com.